Hello everyone and welcome back to Newegg TV. I'm Steve. To my right I have Paul.
Hello.
And we are going to do a CPU cooler category video page for you guys today. So Paul, why don't you take it away? What are we going to start with?
Well, Steve, if you've ever had a CPU, you've known that they get warm. And in order to keep them running optimally and keep them not from dying, you need to cool them off. So we're going to talk about sort of the three main types of CPU coolers that are available for home use, at least. And we're going to start off with these that are right in front of us.
Oh, okay.
And these
stock coolers
are stock coolers. Now, if you've watched our videos before, you might have seen us perhaps scoff a little bit at stock coolers.
Sure.
And it is one of those things that if you get into building systems, you tend to move away from fairly quickly. However, that is not to say that they do not have a place or a purpose, because let's face it, they're essentially free. They come along with most processors that are made to do that, except with the exception perhaps of Intel's enthusiast level processors. But a stock cooler is essentially a basic unit that will keep the CPU running adequately at reasonable temperatures, and they do a fine job. So if you're not going to be overclocking, if you're just building a basic system, or if you're looking to save a little bit of money, a stock cooler is probably going to be the way to go. Now, you'll notice a few things about this cooler. First off, there's a fan on the top, and all the coolers that we're going to be looking at today use some combination of a fan to push air across a surface, or as much surface as possible. So in here, we have sort of some axial fins that kind of protrude from the center. There's actually a copper slug at the middle, and that is what will actually make direct contact with your CPU when this is installed. That helps to transfer the heat out to the aluminum fins. Fan blows air actually downward over those, and then it pushes out from those fins, and it keeps the CPU nice and cool. Another benefit of these is that they're fairly simple to install. So they use push pins that you can see the 4 of right here, and you basically line it up on top of the CPU, push those push pins in, they'll snap into place, and then you're good to go. Another thing you might notice about these stock fans is they do, of course, have a plug for the fan on the cooler. Usually these days, most fans will be 4-pin, as you can see like this. That means it's PWM, or pulse width modulation capable, which means that your motherboard, when this is plugged into the CPU header, is going to be able to regulate the speed on the fan to make sure that if the CPU is getting hot, it will increase the speed, push more air over those fins, or if the CPU is cool, if it's idling, if you're not doing much with the system, it'll lower the RPMs and keep things a little bit more quiet for you.
Very cool. All right, so Paul, I wanted to ask you about this one in particular. It's clearly a stock Intel cooler, but it's much larger than the standard size. What is this?
That's right, Steve. I kind of just put this out to show off a little bit because you can't really get these. This is a LGA 2011 stock cooler, so it's made for Intel's enthusiast platform. And actually, those CPUs are the ones I said that don't ship with coolers, because they know that people who are going for that higher level of performance are almost invariably going to be buying an aftermarket cooler, which we're going to move on to in just a moment here. But these do exist, and I happened to get one at the LGA 2011 launch, so just a little nugget to share with you guys.
That's awesome.
But one other thing I wanted to point out about stock coolers, and I have one here that is unused thus far. Actually, quite a few of these that are unused. Is that they will come almost all the time, or pretty much everyone that I've seen, will come with thermal paste pre-applied. So those gray strips you can see there at the bottom are actually thermal paste strips. There's a fingerprint that you might be able to see on there because I touched it accidentally at one point. You want to try not to touch that, and actually not to touch any of the surfaces that will make direct contact with the CPU or the cold plate or the block right there. Because oils from your skin can get on there, and it's just best to avoid. However, the nice thing about that, again, going along with the convenience factor of the stock coolers, is with that pre-applied, it means you can just get your CPU installed, drop that down right on top of it, and install it. The pressure from the pins and pushing up against it will help to spread that thermal paste out, and that will give you a nice, good contact between the cooler and your CPU, and it'll make sure that everything's running nice and smooth. However, the alternative to that is that if you are, say, already running a stock cooler or something like that and you want to upgrade, it means that you are going to have thermal paste that's on there. And old thermal paste you should always clean and remove before installing a different cooler. So there's various ways to do that. I generally recommend maybe a 50-50 blend of isopropyl rubbing alcohol and water.
90% or?
Yeah, 90%. Just the common kind that you can get at the liquor store. Basically, dab that on with a paper towel, or better yet, a coffee filter,
Yes.
because it'll leave a little bit less of fibers and that sort of thing. Clean it off a few times, make sure it's nice and smooth again. Try not to touch it with your hands directly, and then you can reinstall whatever CPU you're moving on to install.
So to add that thought too, I mean, if you accidentally do touch the CPU or the cooler, you could actually use a cleaning solvent like that.
Yes, you can definitely do that.
Actually purchase some too out there.
And then there's also thermal adhesive remover you can buy directly. Newegg sells that as well. So if you do it a lot, I recommend that because it's actually quite effective. But we've mostly been looking at some AMD stock heatsink fans. I'm sorry, we've been looking at Intel. Here's one from AMD. And this one, as you can see, also has the thermal paste pre-applied. The AMD coolers have been using a very, very similar mounting solution for quite some time, which is very nice because it means if you bought a custom AMD cooler 4 years ago, chances are you can still use it. And while these do improve and there's new ones that come out over time, chances are if you have one that works well for you, you can keep using it. They don't really run out very much except maybe the fan. But the AMD ones just have a slightly different mounting mechanism. It'll have two brackets on either side. It hooks on one side and then you hook on the other side and then you flip this little guy over and it installs. But we covered the installation in our CPU video, so I didn't want to dwell too much on that. But do bear in mind there are different stock heatsink fans for both AMD and Intel processors.
So I noticed that that obviously is using air, and I know we have some more air coolers, but clearly this one's slightly different. It looks like it has heat pipes built into it, right?
That is true. So this is actually a stock AMD heatsink from the age when they were making slightly nicer ones, and copper was actually a little bit less expensive at that time as well. So this one is using some heat pipes, and this is the beginning of some discussion about heat pipes. You also notice again copper all the way across the bottom here, and copper is just a better conductor of heat than aluminum is, and far, far better than air, of course, which is why we can't cool our CPUs with air. But having a copper base plate is going to help to transfer that heat more efficiently. Having the copper heat pipes is going to help to draw that away from the hotter part of the plate here and out into the fins, again to aid in the cooling and disbursement of that heat out into the rest of your case.
Fantastic. All right, Paul. So as I mentioned earlier, I have a series of air coolers over here for your CPU, air-based CPU coolers, I should say. And there's several names here. What did you want to start with?
Well, that's a good question, Steve. So first off, these are aftermarket coolers. That's what this stage 2 is. We're moving on to is not just the stock coolers that come right along with the CPU, but something you buy separately, CPU not included. And generally speaking, these are going to perform much better than the stock coolers as far as cooling goes. And often they will also be much quieter, so that's another benefit. The fans from the stock heat sinks they're often not super high quality, so over time they can get louder, especially if they get gummed up with dust and that sort of thing. But I have an assortment of coolers over here. You'll notice we got a Noctua one over there. We also have a Cooler Master Hyper 212 Evo, which is an extremely popular cooler, very high performance at a very, very reasonable price. So that's kind of one of the champions. Hyper 212 Plus is what it was earlier version, but the Hyper 212 Evo is a current one. There is a Scythe low profile one there as well.
It's good for some HTPCs.
Which is good for HTPCs. That one might not still be available at Newegg because it's slightly older, but I wanted to show a low profile one. But why don't we start with the Sigmatech that's right there already out of the box.
Right over here. Then.
So this is the Sigmatech Dark Knight, very popular cooler. This one's been out for quite some time, and this one's also been used, so it's a little bit dusty. But here is what's known as a tower design for CPU coolers. So the CPU would be down there at the bottom. These are actually copper heat pipes. They just the whole thing has this this coating to provide a little bit of extra surface area as well as give it a really nice stealthy look. So that could be another reason to upgrade your stock heatsink fans if you really want something that looks a bit nicer. And then they have a full-size 120mm fan with white LEDs, so that's going to be pushing air back and across these fins. Again, the same general idea. At the bottom, you have some copper contact. This is a method that's been used much more frequently in past years. The Hyper 212 will also use this method, which is that they've taken the heat pipes, flattened them out at the bottom, and the heat pipes actually make direct contact with the CPU.
HDT, if I'm not mistaken.
Yes,
right?
the heat pipe direct contact, I believe, is, I'm not sure if that's actually industry-wide or if that's only a branding of one of the specific brands, but yes, the heat pipes are making direct contact, so you can see the copper there at the bottom, and it's across the board. Every cooler I've seen that uses this method seems to do a better job at that. But apart from that, one thing to point out about this method is that sometimes you can end up with some grooves in between. So you can see I've actually used this before, so you can see some of the thermal paste that's still in there. So that's something to consider when you're applying thermal paste in the first place. Generally speaking, you'll use a small dot of thermal paste at the center of the CPU, but in some cases, especially with these, where the grooves would prevent the thermal paste from spreading evenly across the entire top of the CPU, you might consider spreading it out. And please feel free to disagree with me in the comments if that's how you feel, because I know there are many schools of thought on thermal paste application. But that's just something I've experienced in the past.
Definitely heard that myself as well, and
Yes.
I've been pummeled in the comments too.
Well, haven't we all, Steve? Haven't we all?
Right.
But apart from that, this is again using aluminum fins up at the top here. Again, everything's just coated in black, and you can see the heat pipes come right up here to the top. One thing about heat pipes, there's actually a type of gas in there that will transfer phases between liquid and gas, and basically when it's hot, it will rise up the heat pipe. It will cool off as the heat is dispersed up here. It will accumulate on the edges of the heat pipes and drain back down to the bottom.
By that you mean that it changes state from liquid to steam or gas, and then it goes to the top. And
Yes,
condenses,
depending on the heat pipe. There's some that work slightly different ways, but that's a general idea. And because liquid water in particular is very good at absorbing heat and transferring it, that's sort of the way that those heat pipes work. So the reason I bring this up is you cannot cut these. I've seen at least one story of somebody not having quite enough room in his case, and I'll just shave the top off of those. If you happen to puncture these heat pipes, they will not function anymore. So never try that. But that's I'm sure most of our viewers have not tried that before.
Well,
but
some customizing out
something
there,
to consider.
that are thinking.
Okay, but the other reason I wanted to talk about the Dark Knight here is because I have the full mounting assembly out for it right over there. So let's take a look at that next. Now you can imagine there would be a motherboard in between this, and then this crossbar here at the center would actually go across the top of that and hold this down against the motherboard. But one thing about aftermarket coolers is they can often be one of the most complex things in the computer building, and much more so than just the simple push pin version that you see right over there.
Definitely.
So the Sigmatech has a system that I actually like a lot. So it's got a back plate there that would go on the back of your motherboard. Then you would screw these screws on from the top to hold that in place, and then you have these screws that attach that cross beam on. I like this one because you can get everything installed like that. Oops, I'm losing pieces at the same time. You can get everything installed like that, and then you can drop this on like so, and then you can put that beam in and hold it in place. So having that ability. Again,
anytime
yes.
you have a system and it's on its back, or if it's upright when you're installing it, it's obviously going to be easier if it was upright. And in order to have some way to screw this in to hold itself together is so much easier than having to somehow, some way, set up a book underneath it to sandwich it up, or have a friend come over and hold it from the other side.
That is true, very true. So just bear in mind, if you are going to be installing an aftermarket heatsink, read the manual. That is always important to go by those instructions, simply because what you're really doing is you're putting pressure on top of your processor, which is down here right in the middle, and you really want to make sure that you're not doing that at an angle or off center or anything like that. So you want to make sure you have all the hardware in place, so you're not putting any excess pressure on the processor itself or on the socket that's down below it, because that's often very delicate. But again, A lot of these will use these back plates, so that's another reason to possibly check on your case, because a case might have a space behind the motherboard tray to allow you to install that back plate, and especially if you're going to be rocking a stock heatsink first and then upgrading to one of these, very, very nice to have that available, because that means you won't have to remove your whole motherboard just in order to install your aftermarket heatsink.
Excellent. Okay, what did you want to look at next?
Let's take a look at some of the other form factors for these aftermarket heatsinks. We've got a few over there. So here's a couple more just various form factors. I want to show a couple more examples. So here we have the Noctua, which I believe is the NHL12, which is gives you some low profile options. There's actually a 120 millimeter fan that's supposed to go up on here that I'm currently using on the other side of the room, so sorry that's not available, but you can see, yes, that's a Noctua fan. So this one is actually going to be downward firing again, so this will sit on top of the CPU like so, which goes right down there, and you can see there's the base plate. You'll notice they often polish these very, very much, and that is to provide as much contact directly between the base plate and the CPU as possible. But this is going to give you a few more options as far as configuration goes. Having the downward firing fan is sometimes more desirable for folks. I've seen, for instance, this type of fan used on a very small motherboard, and it provides a lot of extra airflow over the other components of the motherboard itself.
VRMs and such.
Yes, the power delivery elements that are around your CPU often get very warm, and having airflow over those can be very helpful. So
Nice.
there's an example from Noctua, and they're also another really they're a high-end aftermarket CPU heatsink fan maker that they also make really nice fans. So I know that's one that our fans would have wanted included, although I don't have the NHD14, I'm sorry, right now. But here's another version here. Again, this is a side fan, but this is a low-profile cooler. So if you're building an HT-PC, a mini PC, something that's that's a very small form factor, and you're very limited in the amount of space that you have in your case, going with a low profile will be almost a requirement. And the height, the Z height, or height from top to bottom, is going to be very important on that. So here you'll notice they've actually fit the fan on this one underneath the fin array, and that's still going to be pulling air across those fins, so it's still going to be an effective cooler, but it helps keep everything really, really compact in a very small space. But you still have all the other elements there, the heat pipes, the aluminum fins, and I've used that cooler specifically, and you can actually even do a little bit of overclocking with it. So those are some of the benefits of third-party aftermarket heatsink fans. Again, better cooling, which you can often translate into more performance by allowing it to overclock your processor, and then also sound generation, or the amount of noise that they create, is much, much less in many, many cases than with the stock heatsink fans. And using larger fans as well, like the 120 millimeter fan over there on the Sigmatech, larger fans can move more air while they're spinning more slowly. So larger fans will often be quieter as a result.
Okay, Paul, so I'm guessing now that means stage 3 on your right.
Yes, stage 3, the highest stage. All right, so next up what we're going to talk about is what is known as all-in-one liquid coolers. Mm-hmm. So these have actually only become popular, I'd say, in the past 3 or 4 years. Because prior to that, there was lots and lots of water cooling going on. You go back to the earliest stages of computing, and it was just something that made sense from a physics perspective. Right. Water is so good at absorbing heat and moving it from one place to another. There were people water cooling computers. I couldn't give you an exact date, but it's going on for at least tens of years.
Ever since the heat engine was created for the vehicle.
Exactly. So now we have a really, really wide variety of all-in-one liquid coolers. You'll also hear these referred to as CLCs, or closed-loop coolers. And the idea here is that you have an all-in-one unit which has, actually, maybe I should take one of these out of the box first before we go into that. So the closed-loop cooler we're looking at here is the Corsair H105, and Corsair has a very, very wide variety of coolers in their Hydro series that are all closed-loop coolers of different shapes and sizes. But essentially what you have here is the base plate, which is the copper, again, that makes contact with the CPU, and you can see some pre-installed thermal paste right there. They've already installed part of the mounting system here as well. On the other side, you have a Corsair logo, and this is going to light up, but actually what's also included in here is a pump. So the pump and the base plate are in one unit right there. You have tubing right here, one's an inlet, one's an outlet, and that will then take the liquid over, across, and through the radiator. Radiator here is fairly standard. I mean, radiators, again, have been around for many, many, many years, since the industrial age began, because things get hot, you need to cool them down.
Right.
Water basically goes through all the straight lines here. You can see through the channels. There's a bunch of zigzaggy aluminum fins in between those. You can see through it, so that is where the air moves across, and then these will have fans that can be positioned on top of them, and those are going to be pushing air across the radiator. Now, one thing to note about the fans that go with these closed-loop coolers is one of the most important specs on the fans for radiators is going to be the static pressure.
Right.
Usually, that's measured in millimeters of H2O, which is referencing how much water the fan can actually push.
Nice.
Because pushing is absolutely necessary. Maintaining static pressure across the radiator is what's going to help move the air across more effectively. Another thing you can also do with radiators like this, and by the way, this one is 240 millimeters long and has two 120 millimeter fans that would go on it, like so. You also have 120 millimeter by 120 millimeter radiators, such as the Anti-Cooler H2O 950 that we have over here. And those are just smaller, less surface area. It's not going to provide quite as much cooling, but all of these all-in-one coolers are going to give you much, much better performance than the stock coolers right out of the box. And they also ship better, which is one of the features that I liked about them, because rather than having a big unit hanging directly off of your motherboard, you have this, which you can bolt with 4 or 8 connection points directly to your case, which is much more stable for if you're going to be shipping a system. But still remove your graphics card if you're going to be doing that. I
was going to add to that too, that you could also add 2 more fans in this case for a 240 or a 280, right? And then
yes.
You can add a push-pull configuration.
That is very correct, Steve. So push-pull is just, again, going to give you more airflow across those fins. So here, these would be in push configuration right now, because the top of the fan there is going to be pushing air that way. If I installed 2 more fans down here at the bottom, also pushing air that way, they'd both be working together to move more air across the radiator, and that will give you very good cooling. So an aftermarket cooler is definitely the way to go if you are planning on overclocking your processor and getting a little bit of extra performance. And a closed-loop cooler is going to give you the top-level performance when it comes to looking across all these. And the closed-loop coolers that have the largest radiators, then thicker radiators will generally perform better than smaller or thinner radiators as well, because it's just surface area. There's more surface area, and they can dissipate more heat.
So then on top of that, do you recommend anybody actually creating their own custom loop?
Well, that is probably, well, I don't want to say the pinnacle of CPU cooling, because if you want to talk about that, you go into exotic cooling methods. It goes,
record-breaking.
It kind of goes to like phase change, which are very expensive units that just the cooling unit itself costs as much as your computer, which is somewhat impractical. And then beyond that, you go to exotic cooling, which is using stuff like liquid nitrogen or liquid helium, which is really cool for an overclocking event and seeing how fast you can overclock a processor, but nobody regularly cools their system with liquid nitrogen. It's just infeasible. You'd have to have a bunch of liquid nitrogen and be pouring it on and adding more all the time, and those are mostly just for press events and conventions and that sort of thing. But back to your question, which was a custom loop, and the cool thing about more recent coolers that have come out, and I will be using this Glacier 240L from Cooler Master as an example of this, is some of them, as opposed to being a completely sealed loop like these, which is nice because no maintenance is required, are giving you the option to start with the closed loop cooler and then to open that loop in the future and possibly integrate it into what is known as a custom loop. A custom loop is going to require certain elements. It's going to require basically the elements that you have here, but with custom you do it separately. So you're going to need a pump to move the liquid through the loop. You're going to need a block, which is the unit that actually attaches to the CPU. And then custom loops, you can actually get blocks for your GPU as well. You can get blocks for the power delivery on your motherboard. You can even get blocks for the memory, which I personally think is a little silly, but it definitely looks cool for people who kind of go all out. But give me just a moment, and I'll pull this out, and we'll take a closer look. So here's the Glacier 240L out of the box, and you guys might notice this tube just hanging loose. I actually did a sort of custom loop with this to cool a video card that came through, so that is why this currently is not filled with liquid. they will ship with liquid and all the connections connected, so you can essentially use it like a closed loop cooler. However, as you can see here, the tubing is a standard size, and this isn't really a water cooling video, so to speak, but make sure that you're getting the right sizes if you're going into water cooling. Maybe we'll do a video on that in the future. But you have barbs down here like this one, and that is what the tube connects to, like so. You have a clamp right here that's holding it in place, and again, if you don't touch that, it'll be fine and you won't need to do anything with it. Apart from that, it's kind of the same layout as far as where everything is connected as with the H105. You have a larger pump right here because this one is more powerful than the H105, and that is going to allow you to add additional items to the loop if you choose to do so. So, for instance, a reservoir would be something that you'd want to add if you're going to make this a custom loop, because you need a reservoir so that you can see. You'll have some evaporation over time, so your reservoir might need to be topped off periodically. Also, flushing the loop periodically is another good way to make sure that you're not having any corrosion or that sort of thing built up.
Although this one does actually have a reservoir.
This one does have a
a
small reservoir right here, so depending on how you configured it, yes, you could open that up and use that to top it off. But again, having a reservoir also lets you see the liquid, depending on if you get an opaque one or not, but that's also kind of cool. Yeah, and then generally speaking, again, with something like this, it gives you the option to water cool other elements of the PC. It gives you the option to start out with something that's a little bit more simple to install for the first time, but then possibly give you that upgrade path in the future. And if you build your own system, that's what I love about it most, is an upgrade path, something you can change in the future, some reason to dig in there and tinker with your system. And then another feature of this particular radiator is these cables that are hanging down over it. Another feature of this radiator is these are actually copper fins on this radiator rather than aluminum. And I've done testing actually with quite a few closed loop coolers, and again, I have found copper is just better than aluminum at dissipating heat. So having a copper radiator, another little bump up you can go for if you're looking for additional performance. So that is a quick look at the Glacier 240L from Cooler Master.
So then that's a good point you were mentioning before about upgrades that I wanted to add to. Essentially, you know, if you don't have the money, like we were saying in the beginning, just use the stock cooler that comes with your CPU. You can definitely get basic performance out of that. You'll be happy with it, I'm sure, and then it'll make you really enjoy going to that custom loop or that upgraded air cooler.
It gives you a point of comparison.
Right.
And here's a little trick you guys can do at home if you don't mind hurting your fingers a little bit. And this is just something that I do, so take it with a grain of salt. But if I have a computer and it's loud, I can hear a fan spinning, I will go into it and I will gently, ever so gently, stop the fans in the system until I can find out which one is actually the culprit that's making the noise. Again, be very careful if you're going to do this, and if you're worried, just turn your system down first, stop it, and then turn the system back on. But if you do that and you find out that you have say an old stock heatsink fan that's gotten some, probably got some stuff up in the gears or something, and it's having to spin more, or it's gotten really caked on with dust and everything on the top, that's really a great option to say, you know what, I want to take that out, get something like the Hyper 212 Evo. There's a lot of reasonably priced aftermarket coolers in the $20 to $40 or $50 range that can give you a really nice boost in performance, give you more overclocking headroom, and then of course if you just need to do more, and I know the feeling myself, you've got tons of options when it comes to higher level cooling, especially when it comes to the closed loop coolers. And it's really something that I can recommend without reservation at this point. Earlier on, there was a little bit of hesitation, people getting into the closed loop coolers, but they've really come a long way. They're very reliable at this point in time, and there's no maintenance. So you just install them.
So much better than a custom loop in that way.
Run them and you're good to go.
So one last thing I wanted to mention too, if you look inside your computer and you're just trying to figure out what you currently use and you notice a ton of dust caked on it, please shut your system down, take it outside, and use a canned air to blow it all out, because that's going to be important. Secondly, if you notice there's a lot of noise coming from one of those fans, as Paul mentioned before, it's usually an indicator, if it's a ball bearing based fan, that it's failing. You do not want a fan to fail on you. That's why they're making the noise that they do. Now, if it's wire brush based, then you're going to have no sound whatsoever. You're just going to notice your system crashing for no reason, probably due to heat. But another reason to open up that case and do, like once every 6 months, do a cleaning? Depending where you live, how much dust you have in your house. How many animals you have in your household? Every 5 or 6 months is good, unless you keep your computer on your floor, which I never recommend. In that case, like once every month or two, because on the floor your computer is going to get much more dust in it than if you have it
up on the desk, or at least just get it a good couple feet up off the floor.
Fantastic.
That's all.
That's a really good point. Yeah, bigger
public
dust modules on the ground than there are a little higher up. One last thing I noticed that we haven't talked too much about, but we mentioned slightly, was thermal pastes. And I guess you'd want to mention a little bit about this before we move forward, right?
Yeah, that's right, Steve. I kind of brought it out here just as a reminder because again, that's something that you don't always consider when you're switching from one cooler to another, is that you do need thermal paste. Now, fortunately, most of these aftermarket coolers will recognize that. So pretty much, I know every single one that I'm looking at here, I know will come with its own little tube of thermal paste.
Oh, yeah.
So you can go ahead and use that. And for instance, like the Cooler Master one right down there, I'm pretty sure is the one that came with this Glacier 240L. So you can go ahead and use that there. That's going to work just fine. And then again, if you guys want to get into it down in the comments, you can talk about your particular favorite thermal paste, because there's so many of them. When it comes down to it, there's only a few degrees difference in the actual performance of them.
But that's a few degrees,
But there is a
Paul.
few degrees difference. And if you could say, you know what, I'm idling at 28C and I'm you know, like 42 under load, then you know, that's always nice to be able to say, I suppose. But just make sure that you're keeping in mind the consistency of your thermal paste when you're actually doing it. So like this Ice Fusion, for example, which I use just because I have a massive tub of it that I know that's 200 grams. I'm never going to run out of this stuff.
It'll go bad before you ever do.
That's probably true. Some of it will be a little bit more thicker consistency. Some of it is a little bit more liquid consistency. So just bear that in mind when you're actually doing the installation. And just to dab a pea size or smaller, somewhere between a grain of rice and pea at the center of your CPU is really all you need. And then let the cooler do the work of spreading that out after you've installed it, because the pressure combined with the heat after you turn your system on will cause the thermal paste to spread, give you good coverage on that, and make sure that it gets what's called burned in and cured.
Cured, I was going to say, yeah.
Which means that basically it's set for the life of or at least probably a good 5 to 10 years.
Yeah, I mean, it's optimal.
Depending on the paste.
You're going to get numbers that are more optimal after it's cured, absolutely.
Exactly.
So, perfect, Paul. Well, thank you so much for taking the time to explain this to me and everybody out there in the audience. We really appreciate you. And thank you guys also for watching. Don't forget to subscribe to Newegg TV for other tips and videos just like these. If you guys like what you saw today, don't forget to click the like button. And if you haven't already done so, click subscribe. But we will see you guys very soon.
Bye, everybody.